Hi, my name is Chad, and I will be talking about how cognitive psychology explains how we set and pursue goals. So, a good question I have is what is involved with actually completing a goal? What is causing us to have goals, and what causes us to actually complete them? We do see that there are some people who have a much harder time actually having goals and completing them, and then there are some people that do things without even really thinking about it. So here we have some images about the self. On the top right, I had a picture of the homunculus, which is this idea of a person or executive inside our mind that determines how we sense the world, how we process it, and how we interact with the world. So what are goals? Goals are desires or needs that cannot be accomplished without intervention. We understand that with Maslow's hierarchy of needs that there are different levels to the needs that we have. On the bottom we have the physiological, which is essentially the sustenance that we need for our lives. And then at the very top we have self-actualization. What is our purpose? Who are we? Then we have motivation, the capacity to perform a task of perceived importance. And then of course achievement, which is our capacity to actually do well. So here on this behavior change model, we have two factors involved in us being able to complete tasks. On the left, we see that some tasks are determined by our level of skill and ability to do it. And then on the bottom, we see the level of motivation or willpower to actually complete the task. So on the top, you see that the more complex tasks are up there, but on the left, navigating to a familiar place. It doesn't take a whole lot of willpower to do it, but there is some skill involved. And then on the right, we see that there's the much more complex task of navigating in a new city for the first time, which takes a high level of skill and can actually be pretty daunting, so it takes more willpower to do it. And then, of course, we have the bottom ones, which is the simple and routine tasks, such as walking to the mailbox, and a simple but harder task, which is such as changing a diaper for the first time. When looking into the brain for what is involved in setting and completing goals, we have two pretty big systems involved, such as the executive system and the limbic system. So the limbic system involves primarily the amygdala, which is involved in emotion evaluation. This is a bottom-up process in which we get signals of an emotion, and then we decide what to do, how to process it, what to do in the situation that is giving us those emotions. And then on the left, we have the problem-solving frontal lobe, which is more of a top-down system in which some of the behaviors that are involved are learned or habitual. So here we see the amygdala. It is involved in our fight or flight behaviors for fear responses. It's also involved in other emotional responses. But essentially the amygdala sends signals to other parts of the brain, namely the frontal lobe, in which the frontal lobe actually goes through the processes of evaluating what to do in a situation. When the amygdala suffers damage, we see this phenomenon known as hijacking, which is uncontrollable anxiety. It can also cause depression, people not being able to process emotions very well. Impulse control can also become an issue, in which we will be diving further into in other parts of the brain as well. So here we have a study in which scientists were monitoring activation in the amygdala. Essentially, they had rats that were put into boxes, and they were subject to fear simulation by way of odors from a natural predator, such as cats or ferrets. Afterward, these rats were sacrificed, and researchers were using FOS to determine protein signals when they went through those fear responses. And so now we're going into the executive system, which involves the prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, and the basal ganglia. Here we see the thalamus. The thalamus works as a relay station that sends signals to other parts of the brain relevant to the stimulus or the situation that is happening. The thalamus is important for emotional processing, motor control, and information processing, as well as attention. And here we see the basal ganglia. This part of the brain sends signals to relevant muscle groups that causes motions. It sends signals to either have muscle groups be more active or less active to cause different forms of motion. I use the term relevant because when there is damage to the basal ganglia, there can be involuntary motor control, meaning that the body just acts on its own. Damage to the basal ganglia is also linked to obsessive compulsive disorders as a result of impaired reasoning. As we can see, the signals of these parts of the brain go through the brain on a pathway from bottom up, stemming from the amygdala. Here we have a visual representation of executive function. These are the different forms of executive function. Executive function is defined as being able to keep our attention, remember things, juggle multiple tasks, and it is also our ability to reason and complete them. Here I put out some of the important ones, such as attention, working memory, inhibitory control, planning, and task initiation. Task initiation is pretty interesting because people are able to mentally visualize the task at hand and think about how to complete it, but don't actually go through with completing it. Any of these executive functions that are not happening or are dysfunctional, we call that executive dysfunction. We also call it frontal lobe syndrome, especially when there is traumatic brain injury. So when we're going into the frontal lobe, we'll be talking about this man, Phineas Gage, who was in an unfortunate railroad accident, which there was an explosion that drove a tamping iron through his cheek and out through the top of his head. This was one of the first cases of frontal lobe damage, where we get the term frontal lobe syndrome. People said that after the accident, he showed major behavior changes, having inappropriate social behaviors and extreme loss of inhibition. So here we see the prefrontal cortex, which is located in the frontal lobe. This is involved in voluntary movement and expressing languages, as well as higher executive function, which we're talking about. There are three big areas of the prefrontal cortex we're going to be talking about, such as the dorsolateral cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, and the ventromedial cortex. And here we look into the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in autonomic regulation. I mentioned this one first because it's of its close association with the limbic system. As you can see, we've been kind of going on a pathway from the amygdala through the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is involved also in anticipating events and predicting errors, also in empathy, motivation, and attention. People that suffer damage in this part of the brain experience what we call a flat affect, which means that their emotional bluntness means that they don't have any extreme emotion about anything. Damage can also cause symptoms of attention deficit disorder. And here we have the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This one is involved in task shifting, planning, working memory, and inhibitory control. Damage to this part of the brain leads to repetitive behaviors and initiation issues. Initiation issues essentially is just not being able to even attempt to perform a task. And here we have the orbital frontal cortex, which is involved in impulse control, emotion regulation, and decision making. Damage to this part of the brain leads to loss of inhibitions and attentiveness. The ventromedial cortex is also involved in emotion regulation, namely negative emotions, and decision making and social awareness. Damage to this part of the brain leads to inability to recognize emotions on other people's faces, and apathy. Now, to test for executive function, there are several tests involved. One of them that we see here is the trail making test. Essentially, you see that there are a bunch of circles and people have to start at the number 1 and go to 2 and 3 and so on and so forth and make a trail, drawing out a trail on their paper. And then in the second part of the test, they'll have circles labeled 1 through 8, and then other ones labeled A through H. So it's sort of a shift in the actual thinking process. So this tests for attention and mental flexibility. And then we have the digit forward and backward test. This is where an experimenter will cite a number sequence out to you and you repeat it back. And then they'll also tell you to repeat it back to you backwards. This also is used for attention and also for working memory. Another test for executive function is known as the Stroop test. This is a test for inhibitory control. So what we're looking at here is a list of words that visually and literally represent color. On the first list on the left, we see that red is red, yellow is yellow, blue is blue. The second list from the left is incongruent colors. So red is yellow, green is blue, blue is red. And participants will be shown this list of words one by one. And essentially it's meant to measure response time and how well people are able to answer congruent and incongruent words. People should normally take a little bit longer to try to answer or to try to respond for the incongruent words, because you're processing both the color and the word itself. But people with inhibitory control will try to answer faster regardless. And so what we see here is neural imaging during the Stroop test, in which we see that the anterior cingulate gyrus and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex are active during this test. In the anterior cingulate gyrus, we saw that there was most active in the incongruent conditions and least active in the control. So the anterior cingulate gyrus is part of inhibitory control. Another test for executive function is the Wisconsin card sorting test with controlled set task switching. Here we test for mental flexibility and planning. In this test, participants are meant to sort cards based on a set of rules that they're not told about from the researcher. So the researcher gives them feedback of whether or not they are following the rules correctly. And then after so many rounds of sorting cards, the researcher then shifts the rules so that the participant has to show mental flexibility and be able to rethink what the task is. People with executive dysfunction will have a hard time trying to switch between set tasks. And so here we see a study in which researchers were able to get neural imaging of participants while they were taking the Wisconsin card sorting task. There is a lot of activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. As we can see in the image, different areas light up based on different kind of executive functions involved during the task. The green areas are purely from the Wisconsin card sorting task. The red areas were activated during task switching, and the blue areas are activated for inhibition responses or go, no-go. Areas in yellow, as we see in the left hemisphere of the brain, are where the Wisconsin card sorting task and task switching were both activated in the same areas. And then in the right side of the brain, we see some white, actually. Some white areas in the right hemisphere, which all three of the functions are lighting up at the same time, or in the same areas. So what we can tell from this is that the left side of the brain is primarily used in task switching, and then on the right side, The inhibition responses are also involved, and that all three of them are pretty much happening in the same areas. So one more test for executive function. This one is primarily used on young children, known as the marshmallow test. So young children are presented with a marshmallow but are told not to eat it and are left alone in a room for a certain amount of time. And if they complete the task of not eating the marshmallow, then they get 2 marshmallows. So this is definitely a really good test for inhibitory control, especially with young people. And researchers determined that this is actually a good determinant for future outcomes in their life. So the children that show better inhibitory control have future successes or better successes down the road. And so here I listed some of the causes of executive dysfunction, such as PTSD, depression, mental disorders such as Alzheimer's and dementia, brain trauma, especially damage to the frontal cortex, Huntington's, and attention deficit disorder. And so here we have a study in which researchers tested patients with PTSD with executive function tests. There was 28 PTSD patients and 28 trauma-exposed patients, basically went through exposure therapy. The PTSD group scored lower in the executive functions of flexibility, set shifting, planning, and working memory, but they did score higher than a control group in inhibition control. So here's 3 documented cases of executive dysfunction. These 3 individuals did present with tumors in their brain, but researchers realized that the tumors were not, in fact, the main effect of the executive dysfunction. So first we had a 27-year-old female who presented with issues with motivation, attention, memory lapses, and repetitive speech. But she also had a history of Huntington's that leads to the breakdown of cells and neurons. And then next we have a case of a 70-year-old male, issues with planning, decision-making, and apathy towards their own family. He was also diagnosed with ADHD and memory impairment. And then last we have a 62-year-old female, also having issues with planning, decision-making. She would ask repetitive questions, the same questions over and over, and forgetfulness, more memory lapses. And she was also diagnosed with ADHD and memory impairment. There was also a case of a 9-year-old boy who had suffered an extensive brain injury and had issues with inhibition control. So here we see on the bottom is a little diagram of neural activity going through the executive system, kind of in a cycle, in which you have the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and the prefrontal cortex, all involved with processing actions and intent and situations in order to predict the world and to better be able to behave in it. I think that Professor Havas's integrated neural system for mental simulation is a pretty good theory for understanding people being able to have mental simulation, being able to go through things in their head and in their minds without actually having motor function going on. And this could explain a lot about executive dysfunction, in which people do have ideas of what they're going to do and can even mentally simulate what they're going to do, but then find themselves not actually doing that. And that could be a result from a bottom-up processing. Perhaps the amygdala and the emotion processes just aren't as interested in completing a task, or it's a top-down situation in which the processes are learned about how to complete tasks in a very non-functioning way. We know that there's a lot of brain areas involved with executive function, and for us to actually be able to complete goals, especially when it comes to things like dopamine, whether or not we receive any sort of risk or reward from completing a goal or a task. But we also have habitual experiences that determine whether or not we're going to complete tasks as well. So I'd like to end on that. And thank you very much.